Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. I am super excited to be talking to Chris this morning. Chris is the CEO of Novos Labs, which has a line of science-backed longevity supplements, including their flagship Novos Core, which is a supplement that's designed to target the hallmarks of aging. But I think our conversation today is really to talk about how Chris thinks about aging, how he thinks about addressing aging. And this is something that's important to him, not just from a business perspective, but also personal, right? He is somebody who became very interested in this relatively early, certainly earlier than a lot of us, due to some health challenges that he faced. And he's now brought his own health to a point where his biological age is much younger than his chronological age. And I think importantly, he's a really deep thinker when it comes to aging and how to target it. And he's been somebody that I've been following for a while. We even had some conversations back when I was at Modern Age about ways to work together. So I'm really looking forward to today's conversation to really think about how do we address aging and what are the different tools we have at our disposal. And in particular, how do we think about the role of supplementation? Because I think this is one of the noisiest aspects of this whole field is supplementation and all the different options that people have. How should people think about this? Beyond Novos, or in addition to Novos, how do people think about all this? So, Chris, thank you so much again for joining. Let me just first open it up and say, is there anything you want to add to what I just said? Otherwise, please feel free to introduce how you think about aging to our audience here.
Well, thank you for having me, Doctor. It's a pleasure to be here. And I think you've summed things up quite well for me. Thank you for that. Maybe before even going into how I think about aging, maybe I talk a little bit about my experience, the childhood experience that has led me to think about aging in the first place. And then I think that will give some good context for why I think about aging the way that I do. So, as you alluded to, when I was a teenager, I was stopped in my tracks when I was already living a healthy life. I was exercising, I was weightlifting since I was 12 years old. I was more healthy than most of my peers. But it was much more of a surprise to me and my friends and my family when I would have been struck by a brain tumor. So I suddenly had a seizure one day while on a school trip in New York City, and I woke up with blood all over my shirt, and I had severed my tongue with my teeth, and they rushed me to NYU Langone Medical Center, where they gave me a CAT scan and they found a large mass above my left ear. And it was a pilocytic astrocytoma above my ear, so right in my left temporal lobe. It was bumping up against my memory center and obviously was causing too much pressure, was larger than a golf ball, too much pressure to the point that I had that seizure. And they ended up doing additional studies on me prior to removal, but they had to do emergency surgery. But they found that it was right next to all of my sensory perception. And so even my speech center. So there was a point where they turned it off during the testing, and they asked me how to say banana. They showed me a banana, and I'm thinking to myself, like at 16 years old, like, what kind of idiot do you think I am that I don't know what a banana is? I had no idea what they were really testing, only to find out that I couldn't say the word. I couldn't say banana. And it was a really eye-opening experience for me to go through that. And it transformed my perspective on health, which prior to that was a very superficial version of health, as you could imagine a 16-year-old having. I wanted to be attractive to the girls in school and play sports well. And I wasn't thinking about this idea of disease. I was invincible as a teenager. And going through this experience, I realized that health is really about optimizing our biology to the point that we can perform our best in all capacities, physically, mentally, emotionally, here and now, but also to then stave off disease. And disease is something that can build over time. It's not typically something that just suddenly strikes. Even if it feels that way to us, it's actually been building internally within us, sometimes for years, like my brain tumor was developing for years before it was detected. So coming to that realization, that is when I would say I first became interested in longevity. I was 16, but the term wasn't around. Nobody was saying, oh, the longevity industry or longevity supplements. I just looked at it as anything I'm going to do for my health, I'm going to look at it through the lens of long term health, not just short term outcomes. And I think even today, many people are just focused on the short term outcome. It's human nature. We want something and we want it now. And we're not really thinking about what might happen in 10 or 20 or 30 years from now. But I, at an early age, because of this experience, began thinking, is this recommendation going to not only give me what I seek to achieve today, whether that's improvements in cognition or more energy or better physical performance or better skin? Like you go down the list, is it good for me both today and in the long term, or is it at least neutral in the long term and it's not going to have any negative effects on me? So this is how I was thinking through my teens into my 20s. A dozen years ago, I came across a scientific paper because I was on this website called PubMed. PubMed is where the government has a database of biology and medical studies where you can just do searches through it. And many of those studies are available for free for public access. And I would read through them. And I came across this paper called The Hallmarks of Aging, which identified the biological root causes of aging. And this was an epiphany moment for me because I came to realize that first and foremost, aging is the number one risk factor for disease. So everything from cancer to Alzheimer's and cardiovascular disease and sarcopenia, glaucoma, you go down the list. Aging is the number one risk factor. Aging causes lung cancer at 3 times the rate of cigarette smokes. And who would actually think that's the case? So that's the first realization. The second realization was that there are these fundamental drivers of aging, these hallmarks of aging, which there are now 12 essentially that have been elucidated by researchers. Third is that in order to be called a hallmark of aging, it needs to be something that is shown in animal studies to extend lifespan if you control that hallmark, if you reduce the progression of that hallmark, and shorten lifespan if you accelerate that hallmark. And so that gave me the realization that we've got these knobs and levers that can actually have an impact on the fundamental aging process, which is directly correlated to risk of disease and death. And that gave me the insight, the perspective that I now have on the aging process. And it's what I used to launch the business. I have more to the story than that, but I figure maybe I'll just pause here and see if there's anywhere you'd like to direct me.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Chris. And thank you in particular for sharing that powerful personal story. I think for a lot of us who find ourselves in this field, our why is very often personal. And so I think hearing that is very powerful for all of us. And it's also striking to me to hear how relatively quickly you were able to connect what seemed and is kind of an acute event and a discrete kind of chronic disease with aging, which I think is a leap that even now, like a lot of clinicians are still trying to make, right? Like, how do you think about a disease like cancer and connect it to this more fundamental process like aging? I think in medicine, we like to think about diseases and then prevention, and we kind of separate them into different buckets. And I think what aging is teaching us is that it's really on a continuum and on a spectrum. And so I think it's impressive that you were able to kind of make that connection. I'm curious if you don't mind sharing, was there anything that you learned as you were considering your own personal situation, right? Like as you considered, the development of that, rare cancer, was there anything that you found that, hey, like this is something that was awry with me from a mechanistic perspective, and this is why this happened, and maybe like if you had known this earlier, right? Like, is there anything that you think even plausibly you could have done based on what you know now, having kind of done the deep dive that you did?
So when it happened, I asked the neurosurgeon and my neurologist, why did this happen to me? Like, was this genetic or was it a freak occurrence? And they essentially said this was a freak occurrence. Like, the chances that this happens to you again going forward is essentially the same odds of it happening to you in the first place, which is, let's just say, roughly 1 in 1,000. that wasn't satisfying to me. I'm a curious person and I'm always looking for answers. And I always feel like there's something more to it. Like if we dig a little bit deeper, maybe we will find something that is not apparent at first glance. And so a few years later, in my early 20s, I did 23andMe analysis. And then I took the data from that and I exported it into different tool sets like Genetic Genie. And I don't know if they're still around. This is now 20 years ago, but it essentially was able to look at all of the different SNPs across my genome, and at least those that were tested through 23andMe. And it identified one in particular that increased the risk of a brain tumor. And it basically, that the study that investigated this and came to this was essentially concluding that my risk would be 2x. It would be double that of the normal population. And so now, of course, when it comes to disease and all of these issues, like typically polygenic, it's not one single gene that's going to determine things. Like there might be other genes that offset and reduce the risk. So you can't look at it overly simplistically. But my younger self in my early 20s saw this and found a lot of comfort in knowing this, in knowing that there is actually an explanation for why this may have happened. Now, if I look back on my life, what are the things I could have done healthier? There were a number of things, but whether they would have amounted to a brain tumor, that's a whole other question. I cannot make that leap to say these things would have. Like I'm homozygous for this MTHFR C677T, and I've found that ever since I came to that realization and increased folate and methyl donors in my diet, I feel like a completely different person. And is that going to, the methylation and demethylation, is that going to lead to a brain tumor? Probably not. But that's one factor. I had a crazy sweet tooth, and I was probably getting tons of surges of glucose across my body throughout my youth years. But again, a brain tumor, I mean, tons of kids have sweet tooth. So I don't think that there's anything specific that would have prevented it. It just happened to me. But the things that I was doing back then in terms of not living as healthy and optimized of a version of Chris as I am now, that I've since learned, I think that these things will reduce the risk of any other sort of disease taking place in my life because I'm living a much healthier life today than I was back then.
Got it. I think that's a great reflection, right? I mean, I think there's no way to know with certainty, you know, if something like this could have been prevented. But I think it is, to your point, right? I think in medicine, we're often given very like unsatisfactory answers about things. I remember feeling the same way when I was going through medical training, and I would see a case kind of like yours and essentially just told like, hey, this is just bad luck. And I think in a lot of ways it still is the case, right? Like I think our as much as our understanding has advanced, I think our tool set is still limited in some ways. I think it's progressing dramatically in other ways, and I hope that it will progress across the board. But I think that even in spite of all that, having that nugget of understanding where we now start to see how the pieces can come together and how this can become knowable, right? Like, I think I agree with you. Like, the idea of this just being this completely unknowable thing is not satisfying. But even just knowing, like, hey, this is knowable, we just don't know yet why. I think give
We don't fully understand it necessarily. And I tend to have a quantitative mind. And so I oftentimes think in statistics and odds. And so I look at something like this in terms of what can I do to reduce the odds of something happening? We can't say definitively. We don't understand biology perfectly. And even if we did, we might not be able to control all outcomes. But we can increase the odds that something goes awry and we can decrease the odds. And so I'm trying to stack the odds in my favor. That's how I think about health. And I want to do it in a mindful way, not an obsessive way, not an extreme way, like we hear some public figures in biohacking just being very extreme about things. We got to have high quality of life. We need to enjoy life. We can't have excess cortisol because we had an apple that wasn't organic. Like that apple's still going to be better for you than not eating that apple, even if it's inorganic. So we have to have some balance in our lives, but When sometimes I hear like somebody who, average person, not interested in health, doesn't care for health, they just say, enjoy life, everything's going to kill you. I don't look at it that way. There are certain things that are known to increase sharply the odds of disease, and there are things that are known to decrease very significantly the odds of disease. And I want to put as many things in that bucket as possible and remove as many things from this other bucket as possible while still maintaining a balance and high quality of life in the process.
I think that's very well said. I think maybe we can just pull on that thread a little bit because I think this will be of definite interest to the audience here. I think this longevity and aging movement is playing out not just as a scientific one, but really as a cultural one. And I think that that is playing out in all the messy ways that cultural movements do. I'm curious, like from your perspective, what are some misunderstandings or misconstruals of advice or principles that you see out there that you believe need to be kind of recharacterized? Yeah.
Yeah, so there's a few. One, I think this is a critical one, is people confuse. Let's just get the definition of longevity straight in the first place. Longevity is to increase, first and foremost, your health span. So the period of your life lived without a disease and being able-bodied and sound mind and so on. And then ideally, by extension, you're going to increase lifespan as well. You're healthier for longer, and then you might add some years to the end of your life. So if that is the definition of longevity in a very pragmatic, practical way, when people oftentimes confuse feeling better today, feeling more youthful today for longevity when it's potentially actually even shortening lifespan in the long term. So, for example, if you're pumping yourself full of growth hormone or peptides that raise human growth hormone, you are arguably going to reduce your longevity. You're going to feel great today, but if you have chronically high levels of human growth hormone, you're going to increase your risk of cancer. You're going to potentially shorten lifespan. So that's not to say that there aren't use cases for intermittent doses in certain populations, certain cases. But for somebody who's like, oh, I feel great on HGH or ipamorelin or some sort of peptide, and it's like, I'm going to just now use this for the rest of my life. It's like, yeah, you might feel younger, but don't confuse feeling younger with actually increasing longevity. Now, there are certain things, and I wrote a blog post about this. It's probably 2.5 years ago now. So it's not perfectly crystallized in my memory here. But essentially, what I was saying is that there's a distinction between longevity and performance. And I'm trying to remember the third category, but that if you're really focused exclusively on hyper performance, for example, you might actually be burning the wick on both sides and shortening your lifespan. So I would say, and this is something that's not commonly known. It's well known in the biogerontology field of longevity research, but it's not commonly known in wellness circles, let's say, and by the public. Growth is oftentimes associated with shorter lifespans. And there's exceptions to this, but it's oftentimes associated with shorter lifespans. And breakdown and recycling is associated with longer lifespans. So let me make this real for people. If you fast, when you're fasting, you're not bringing calories in, your body needs to find a source of energy and it starts to recycle cells in our body. That's the process of, for example, autophagy or apoptosis, where a cell essentially commits suicide because it's not performing its function properly. This is, at least in animal models and theoretically, arguably true in humans as well, can reduce the risk of cancer because dysfunctional cells are more likely to be eliminated in this case. That's just one example of benefits that come from it. You have a metabolic reset when you do this. Your blood glucose levels restore, your insulin signaling improves, and so on. And so, in this process, this metabolic signal called mTOR decreases. mTOR is a growth signal. And when you're not getting the food, the mTOR decreases. At the same time, another metabolic signal increases. That's called AMP kinase. This is a cellular starvation signal. When else does AMP kinase get signaled? It's when you exercise. When you're exercising, your cells are saying, hey, I need more ATP. I need more energy. I'm starving. Give me more energy so I can continue to perform for you right now. And so those signals, lower mTOR, higher AMPK, just two examples, there are many others, are associated with longer lifespans. When you go into growth mode, and that is when you're eating very high levels of protein, lots of like sugary carbs, and you're constantly fed, which in the modern environment, we don't have feast and famine cycles like we did throughout evolution. We've only got feast cycles now. That's associated with higher risk of disease and death. And so, along with mTOR and being in these feast cycles, you're also signaling IGF-1 and growth hormone. Those come along with those feast cycles and the mTOR and the growth. And when you're fasted, those levels decline until you eat, then they catapult up again, but then they level off again. So that's just one example of something that I think people misunderstand is that they think that simply feeling better today and growth, 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 that sounds good. And intuitively, it sounds good. But research shows that we actually need these periods of like breaking down, recycling, refreshing. And it should be cyclical. It shouldn't only be breaking down because then you're not restoring. You should have periods of growth and restoration, and then periods of kind of decay and breakdown, and go in and out of them.
And just to kind of, develop that a little bit further, I've read some of your work here, and I think building on what you just said, I know that one thing that, and again, I don't want to mischaracterize it, but you know, it, I know you've been somewhat critical of protein intake and some of the emphasis on protein and meat and that sort of thing. I'm curious, like, how do you think about that within the lens that you just described? Because I do see this debate playing out in this field in general, where there are some people who talk a lot about muscle mass and how you need to have like 1.5, 1.8. The number is sometimes even higher per grams per kilogram of lean body mass. And then there's people like, Walter Longo, for example, who will say, hey, like, actually, that's quite the opposite. We should not be doing that. This actually is counterproductive. And there's a separate set of evidence there. So I'm curious, like, how do you navigate that question in particular? And again, I don't want to like mischaracterize what you've
Yeah.
said. I want to have you speak for yourself here.
Thank you. I appreciate that. So I think, like most things in life, it's nuanced. It's not a simple black and white answer. I think it depends on your lifestyle, your age, even the types of protein that you're eating. At the most simplistic level, I tend to agree with Dr. Longo in the sense of having too high protein diet, especially animal proteins. And I'll get into why animal proteins. It's not some sort of vegan agenda or anything. I eat animal proteins. Too high animal proteins for too long is constantly activating mTOR, and it is associated in study after study with shorter lifespans in animals, but also associated in humans with higher rates of aging and so on. Now, we also have to look at the reasons why people pass away in the first place. And if someone at 80 years old has weak legs and they fall, and they don't die from the fall necessarily, but they're in a wheelchair and then 6 months later they pass away, we have to be aware that this is actually a significant risk factor for the end of life, whether it's some sort of physical trauma or cancer or heart disease. A death is a death. And so we need to figure out how do we mitigate or reduce the risk of death. I'd say, first of all, as you get older, you do need higher levels of protein. 60 plus, you're going to want higher levels of protein than the younger version of yourself because it is harder to maintain muscle mass because of sarcopenia setting in. You're not absorbing the protein as well. So you need more protein when you get older. Also, your appetite declines when you get older. So it's that much more important to increase the ratio of protein in your diet when you're older. Now, if you're older in your 60s plus, you're having trouble getting enough protein in your diet, forget everything I say about animal protein. Like just eat it. Just eat the protein. It doesn't really, don't obsess over the details. But if you're younger, if like I'm 41 years old, at my age now, I do have animal protein. I eat fish. I had eggs yesterday. Occasionally I'll have red meat, but very rarely, like lean cuts, maybe once every couple of months. And then I'll have chicken every so often too, but mostly fish and eggs when it comes to animal protein. I'll eat that. And then I'll also have proteins from beans and other plant-based sources of protein. Why plant-based sources of protein as opposed to animal-based? Well, animal proteins, depending on the type, have different types of amino acids and molecules in them that are associated with aging. So, for example, methionine and isoleucine have been studied in animals. And time after time, when you have higher levels of methionine or isoleucine in the diet of the animal, they live a shorter than average lifespan. And when you decrease levels of those specific amino acids, they live longer than average. These amino acids can activate again that mTOR signal and overactivate it for too long. So that's a signal that hey, maybe we don't want to overdo the animal protein. When we look at dairy, so non fermented dairy, so regular milk, let's say, raw or homogenized milk, it has a high level of a molecule in it called galactose, not lactose, but galactose. And galactose is also associated with shorter lifespans. In fact, it's oftentimes given in animal studies specifically with the intention of shortening the lifespan. That's an example of something where like do I have dairy in my diet? Yeah, but I try to have like it's usually cheeses. I'm not drinking regular milk. I'm having maybe some cheese, goat cheese or what have you, and a moderate amount in my diet. So overall where I stand on it is that if you're weightlifting, yes, you need higher levels of protein, but you don't need a gram per pound. Like I weigh 175 pounds or so. I'm typically getting about 120 grams of protein a day. That's plenty. I deadlift 2.5 times my body weight. I bench press a lot. Like I have muscle mass as my points, and I'm only having 120 grams. Probably half of that is animal and half of it is plant based, and I'm perfectly fine. Maybe if I was an Olympic athlete, I would do things a little bit differently, but to maintain adequate, powerful muscle, you don't really need more than that. If you're not weightlifting, have a little bit less protein. You don't need as much as I'm having. You're not going to utilize it as much. And then if you're older, don't bother thinking about plant versus animal proteins. Like get your proteins first. And only after you're getting your proteins, then you could be selective about what those proteins are.
Well, thank you for sharing that. And I'm sure that there are some people listening to this either now or in the future whose heads are boiling or whatever. And I really wish that we could have conversations like we're having right now from a tone that I think you just brought, which is really just objective, neutral, not getting so wrapped up in. And it's hard because food and stuff like this is so tied to identity and things like that. But I think, we just need to engage with the science more directly and more objectively. I really appreciate that perspective. And yeah, I would tend to come out kind of where you are on my thoughts on this, but I would just add that at the end of the day, and this is something that I think connects to what you said before about growth hormone, and I think you can extend some of that to hormone replacement therapy, TRT. At the end of the day, there are many, many different levers to pull to influence aging, right? And so rather than getting people hung up on one, like I like to find what are all the different levers that I can pull. Well, at the same time, if somebody's going to ask me, like, what would you do? Like, what is your own opinion? Then I will give it to you, right? And I would say my opinion is similar to yours. But I think at the same time, the other perspective I sometimes have is like, well, sometimes doing something that isn't optimal in one domain enables people to be optimal in another, right? So that's kind of the lens through which I think about hormone replacement therapy, right? I mean, I do think some of the science that you cite around that is indisputable. I mean, in fact, there's animal studies that show that, basically functional eunuchs, right? Like animals that have zero hormone production actually live very long. But at the same time, I don't think that's something that most people want for themselves. And so like sometimes I think and I say, hey, like maybe this person takes TRT and what it gives them is the motivation and the mental state and the physiological state to then do all these other things that are going to help their lifespan in a much more broad way. Like they're going to sleep better, they're going to exercise more, they're going to feel more motivated, feel more confident. That's going to buy them a lot relative
Oh
to,
yeah.
well, maybe like this therapy in and of itself may be actually activating mTOR and these sorts of things. The lens as a physician that I sometimes try to bring to how I think about this, but I can see that that's also a part of your thinking too.
Yeah, and I completely agree with your perspective on this. And if you remember towards the beginning of the conversation, I said like there's this bucket of things that might accelerate aging, there's this bucket of things that might decelerate aging, and then there's probably a neutral bucket too that has really no impact. And then I also emphasize the difference between quantity of life and quality of life. And for every single one of us, it is a very personal, distinct experience. And so while what I'm saying, for example, about protein or about human growth hormone, it might be what the scientific data is pointing towards, and we're not even conclusive on it, but very strong indication that this is probably what is the case or is true. That doesn't mean that you need to be a perfectionist about every single item that is possible under the sun. There are influencers, like I mentioned earlier, who try to do that. I think that it's better to have a balance in your life. And so this is what I meant when I said that before, which is that, hey, if you like grilling your meat and eating that every weekend, enjoy it. It's okay that it's not the most ideal thing for your longevity, but then go for a bike ride, do other things as well in your life to try to maybe offset that a little bit. And then to your point, I think it's a great one. If somebody has very low levels of testosterone, first, I would say maybe we should try to figure out why they're so low and correct that first. But let's just say we've tried and we can't figure that out, and TRT becomes an option for that person. If you have moderate levels of testosterone, you're probably fine. It's probably not doing anything to your lifespan. It's really when you get high levels, getting 1200, 1300 levels for testosterone. Okay, now that's getting quite high. But also, to your point, if the higher testosterone now motivates you to get off of the couch and to exercise and to be social and to be communal and to have purpose in your life and to maybe now start eating healthier because you feel more empowered and all of these other things, there are all of these second order effects of that testosterone that far outweigh the negative from that testosterone. So, whenever I give a suggestion of like, this is what research finds and this is what's best for longevity, it's always with the caveat that it's looking at that kind of in isolation and just giving you the information for you to decide yourself, is this ultimately what's best for me, considering all of the other variables in my personal life? Maybe it would be better for me to have even less animal protein than I do in my diet, purely from the perspective of longevity. But I love eating the animal foods that I eat. And so I'm just going to balance it. I'm going to have a little bit of a compromise rather than throwing it out completely.
I think that's very well said. Let's maybe now shift to supplementation, which I know we kind of alluded to at the beginning. I think certainly lifestyle behaviors are foundational, nutrition, exercise, sleep. I think there's still a lot of debate about the role of supplementation. There are some who say this is all completely worthless. That's certainly when I was trained in medical school and in residency, we were just told that supplements were just a way to make your pee very expensive. I think that's still a belief that is out there. And then there's also other people who take it to the other extreme and they're on, hundreds. I think Brian Johnson takes, I think, 111 or something like that per day. And then there's everything in between, right? So, how would you, obviously having spent a lot of time thinking about this, what would you tell somebody who maybe just said, Chris, like I feel like I'm totally confused. Some people say this is worthless, and I see people who are taking 200 supplements a day and they have the lowest biological age ever. Like, what do I do? Like, how do I make sense of this? What's your
Yeah.
answer to that? Yeah.
So I think the answer is in between those two extremes. I think that when you hear an influencer saying that they've got the lowest biological age ever, you need to question whether that's truly the case. And maybe they're taking 10 tests a month and they're only cherry picking the best results. Also, are they doing far more than just supplements? Are they also doing genetic modifications to themselves? Are they taking hormone therapies? Are they taking prescription drugs? And the answer to one famous person in the space is yes to all of that. They've even done the genetic modifications. So to say that it's, oh, trust me, it's this supplement that I'm selling, I think you got to be careful in believing that you're going to have those results. So getting back to your initial point, I kind of chuckled when you mentioned creating expensive urine from taking supplements. That was the perspective I was concerned about before starting my company Novos. And when I met with scientists like David Sinclair and George Church and Matt Kaberlein, these world-renowned geneticists and biogerontologists, about this before I even had a business idea for it. I was really just trying to learn and explore possibilities. I asked them, are supplements capable, nutritional supplements capable of having a favorable effect on these fundamental hallmarks of aging. And I was surprised to hear from every single scientist I spoke to, which was about 7 or 8 of them, that yes, natural substances can have a favorable effect in humans on these hallmarks of aging. And the only consideration was pharmaceutical drugs can be more targeted, and you might be able to get away with much smaller doses, like 10 micrograms of substance X. Whereas with a natural substance, it might be a little bit dirtier. It might impact other biopathways in a less targeted way. And you might need 5 grams of that substance instead of just a few micrograms, so a higher dose. But at the end of the day, the answer is yes, you can favorably impact these hallmarks. So now take the other extreme of taking everything under the sun that's associated with longevity. What's the flaw with that? There's been multiple studies. The most recent one came out of a researcher's lab, actually, one of the researchers I did meet with in person in Switzerland at the University of Lausanne. His name is Professor Ocampo. He's famous for the work that he's done with Yamanaka factors, where he made mouse livers young again, old aged mice. It was a controlled study using Yamanaka factors. First time in a living organism was able to restore the youth of the livers in these old animals. So he's an expert in the field, very well respected. He had a paper that came out in 2025 that looked at, it was a study done in C. elegans, and they took longevity compounds, both natural and prescription, and they all had to have favorable effects on lifespan. And then he stacked them, and he found even just two ingredients together more often than not did not have any additional benefit, not even additive, not even, if substance X increased lifespan by 10% and substance Y increased it by 10%, forget about getting it to 20%. It didn't even get to 11%. More often than not, they either neutralized each other or in some cases even counteracted each other, where instead of 10 plus 10 equals 20, it was 10 plus 10 equaled 5 or 0 or -5 in some cases, where it could have shortened lifespan by stacking them. Now, someone might be thinking, like, why is that even possible? How could that happen? It's because biology is complex and the molecule could be activating pathway A. And then the other molecule might also activate pathway A, and now it's overactivated. Or in another scenario, molecule one activates pathway A, molecule two activates pathway B, but they kind of counteract each other or they conflict with each other. And so there are multiple different reasons why combining things might actually lead to a worse outcome when it comes to longevity. So it's not like I grew up with video games and I think of video games as like, oh, when you earn enough points, you can then buy different skills in the game, like energy and speed and stamina and so on. We think of supplements the same way, like more is better. Let me just stack things and I'll get all of these benefits. But biology doesn't work that way. And so, what do I think people should actually do with all of this said? I'm basically saying you shouldn't do no supplements. You shouldn't do 100 supplements. What should you do? I say first start with the basics, the foundations. What are the things that science has proven are essential for health and staving off disease? This is what we have these recommended daily intakes for different vitamins and minerals. It's the family of B vitamins, it's the fat soluble vitamins, A, D, E, K. And it's other substances or molecules that we know have favorable effects like DHA and EPA from omega-3 fish oils. So I typically recommend to start, just make sure you're getting a solid high-end multivitamin, Life Extension brand, Pure Encapsulations, Thorne. These are good brands that make good multivitamins. Get a high quality fish oil if you're not eating enough fatty fish. And make sure it has a low ORAC, that's oxidative value. There's websites that tell you the ORAC rating for different fish oils. Get adequate vitamin D3 and K2, especially if you're not out in the sun all of the time, which most people aren't nowadays. And make sure you're getting adequate magnesium because potassium and sodium and the other trace minerals we're probably getting enough of just through our diet. If you're eating plants and fruits and even animal products will have high levels of those. So start with that as your foundation. I think that those supplements alone get you a very, very long way. And then when it comes to longevity specifically, make sure that the things that you're taking are studied in humans and found to have favorable effects. And I don't mean simply the individual ingredients being studied in humans, the whole formulation being studied in humans. There are a very short list of longevity supplements that have been studied in double-blind, randomized, placebo-controlled human clinical trials. I'm very happy to say that Novos is one of those companies. We're going to be releasing the results from that study very soon. But we found very significant effects on markers that are associated with health span and lifespan in humans. And I think that that's important rather than just taking a cocktail or building a stack of your own when you don't know how the combination of these ingredients are going to add up.
I think one of the things I often think about is how all of this is interacting with biology as a system and how our ways of measuring biological systems are still quite limited, right? I mean, we can measure the end effects, which are integrations of the system over time, but to know at a point in time, like if I take vitamin D plus magnesium plus omega-3, like even that combination, we don't have the tools yet to understand like how does that affect a biological system. And then there's the different compartments, right? Like how that works in my muscle can be different from how it works in my liver, from my brain, and so on and so forth. And so I think like we have to accept that it kind of connects back to earlier, right? Like we're operating on very, very incomplete information, right? And so you have to be comfortable with that. But at the same time, like there are pieces of information that exist. And I think as a physician, like what I like to think, the way I like to think is through the lens of systems biology. Even though I don't have all those tools, right? I always like to think if I'm working with a patient and I have them on X, Y, and Z supplements, what is my mental model of how this is influencing their physiology? Like this pathway does this pathway does this. I don't know if it's exactly perfect, right? But I'm going to gather some data in the future and then I'm going to update my hypothesis. I think that's how we have to be thinking, in my opinion. And then, yeah, like I think that supplements absolutely can. And again, clinically, we see this with patients, like we put them on regimens and they do get better, believe it or not. Sometimes people are incredulous about that. And it is true, right? I'm not lying. You'd have to take my word for it. But these things do work. We need to have the framework. We have to think. We can't just spam supplements like some people do. I think if we're thoughtful about it, I think it'd be tremendously powerful. With all that being said, I'm not going to ask you, it may seem unthoughtful, but this is going to be of interest to the audience. And I think also just gives us an opportunity to think about what's happening. Again, this cultural dialogue through a more thoughtful lens. But like, are there some supplements that you think are getting disproportionate attention relative to the evidence base or kind of like how you would assess the effect on most people? And then on the flip side, are there certain supplements that you think don't get enough attention that actually would have an outsized impact if it was deployed more often?
Mm, yeah. Yeah. Here's an interesting phenomenon that I think will make sense to your audience when I explain the economic incentives behind it. If an ingredient is out on the market, it's already been brought to market without any sort of IP protection behind it, that ingredient can be incredibly powerful, but there's not a financial incentive to really build a brand behind it. Let's say, do further research on it outside of the academic or government sponsored circles. And so there are incredibly powerful ingredients that can be longevity ingredients that just don't necessarily get the attention that they deserve. Then there are ingredients that have IP protection behind them, or it's a brand that's kind of bringing that ingredient to market and they're trying as hard as possible to just build a strong brand around that single ingredient so that they can be ahead of all of the other competition and then kind of just let that carry them. What are the things that I think might be in that category of overhyped? I don't want to throw any companies under the bus, so I'm very hesitant to say it, but I would say that, for example, there's a specific fatty acid out there that's getting a lot of attention that like there's interesting research. Is it solid, strong, and any reason to believe that it's going to increase human lifespan? When I talk to scientific colleagues who've looked at the research, they say that no. There's another compound that is produced in the digestive process from eating a certain fruit. And that has a lot of research around it related to maybe muscle performance and mitochondrial health. But again, same scenario where researchers who are deep in the scientific field and literature say, well, it's not really nearly as strong as it's made out to be. in terms of the potential behind it. And mind you, that's only one single hallmark of aging out of 12. You oftentimes hear about products and companies saying, oh, this is fantastic for mitochondrial health. It's like, okay, great. But what about the other 11 causes of aging? What is it doing for those? If you've got a broken down car and you inflate the tires with air, but the engine is rusted and has no gasoline in it, does putting air in the tires really do anything? So, yeah, it's helpful, but you need to consider the other hallmarks of aging as well. I think NAD plus is very trendy. There's a lot of hype around it. And we as a company, we sell NMN. We were one of the first companies to bring NMN to the market. And that's a precursor to NAD. It increases NAD levels. So is there potential behind NAD? Yes, there is potential behind NAD. Does it deserve as much hype as it's getting? It's looked at as being like the miracle cure. Celebrities are taking it, they're getting IV injections and so on. No, it's a tool in the tool set, but it should not be looked at as this sacred molecule that's going to solve all of, aging ills. It's something interesting. It's got to be researched more. But I do believe, and part of the reason why I founded Novos the way that I did was that I do believe that there's a lot of ingredients out there, natural ingredients that have been around and studied for decades and found to have very favorable effects, arguably more powerful than any of the substances I just mentioned. And because they don't have the IP protection and financial incentives, they are not emphasized as much in terms of marketing dollars and influencer trends and so on, but they are incredibly powerful. I'll give you one example of that. Microdosed lithium, controversial sounding at first, but lithium is something that we got in our water supply. If you have well water or stream water, lithium is an element that leaches into the water, just like magnesium and sodium and potassium. If you eat wild salmon, they have, depending on the region, they can have high levels of lithium. San Pellegrino water brand has high levels of lithium in it. There's many different studies investigating the power of lithium. In fact, Harvard University published one in a very high-powered journal called Nature Aging back in probably around June, July of this past year, and it looked at mice and primates and humans. And I can't make any sort of claims, but essentially it was associating lithium with neurodegeneration and dementia and found really promising potential behind this single molecule. Not to mention, epidemiological studies have found that people with higher levels of lithium in their water supply tend to have lower rates of depression and lower rates of Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. And you go down the list of all of these neurocognitive issues coming from this one molecule. Now, I'm not making any claims clear for FDA purposes and so on. It's not to prevent disease and cope with disease, all of that. But in terms of the potential behind this ingredient that research is pointing towards, it's an incredibly potent ingredient to the point that the world's foremost experts on this molecule, the biologists that study this molecule, have argued that it should be added to the water supply again because of how fundamental and powerful it is. Now, we're not talking about prescription dosages in the hundreds of milligrams. We're talking microdose, like a half a milligram, 2 milligrams. Some people supplement as much as 5 milligrams, but I would say the sweet spot is probably around 1 milligram, where it's safe and can provide a lot of benefits. And so I encourage people to consider something that doesn't necessarily sound sexy as an ingredient because it doesn't have the marketing budget behind it or it's not brand new, but look at the decades of research behind it. And is this something that is truly very healthy when it comes to the question of longevity?
Well, I appreciate you sharing your perspective there. And yeah, I'm sure people can read between the lines and know what supplements you're talking about there. But I think like what you point out though, it kind of speaks to like I think a problem that is more a consequence of the market than it is the companies themselves. And that is that every supplement company, like let's just take those two supplements you mentioned, right? Like I'm pretty sure I know which ones you're talking about. I think they actually can have a role as part of a portfolio approach to aging for certain patients. But the way in which, our market exists, like these supplements have to present themselves as being solutions to almost everything, right? And I think that's where things can get ahead of their skis sometimes, right? Like I think that everyone has to present themselves as being the key to everything. And even like lifestyle behaviors now, I mean, like even the sunlight stuff, exercise, everything sometimes feels like it is the solution to everything, right? I mean, I go to this conference called A4. I think you've been to A4M, right?
Yeah, I spoke at it this.
So if you've attended any of the talks there, right? Like that everyone there is very persuasive. They have a good talk. And by the end of each talk, you're convinced, like, oh God, this is the I gotta start doing molecular hydrogen, or I gotta start doing hyperbaric oxygen. And like you just everything feels like it is the solution to everything. And maybe it can be on some level, because I do think that like everything is connected through a system. But I think that, the market does not reward thoughtful presentation enough, right? Like of of solutions. Like it does not reward nuance, right? Like to say like, hey, this supplement can be part of a portfolio approach to address X condition does not sell as well as the more bold claims. So I think that that is just a reality of how things are. I don't know that there's anything we can do to change that.
Yeah, those are great points. I would also add that everyone wants to jump on the longevity bandwagon and get hype and marketing value from the word longevity. The question then becomes basically the filter that I'm putting the supplements mentioned earlier through. Is it truly a longevity supplement? Is it something that maybe is good for mitochondrial health and increases muscular endurance by a small single digit percentage? Okay, fine. Let's call it what it is. Is it a molecule that's associated with people who live longer lives? Okay, yes, but the French paradox associated resveratrol with longer lives. And it turned out resveratrol did not live up to the hype. It's not even orally bioavailable. So just because it's associated, correlation doesn't imply or definitively point to causation, as we all know. So I guess my point is, are these molecules being studied in, for example, animal lifespan experiments and found to extend health span and lifespan? If the answer is no, okay, well, that's one of the fundamental things that a biogerontologist is going to look at to determine if this is a longevity substance. Does it, at least in a human study, does it have impact on functional biomarkers, not surrogate markers, but actual functional biomarkers associated with longer health spans and lifespans or associated with diseases that progress with age? If the answer is no to both of those questions, now you have to start asking, like, does this have like a very specific benefit that is being broadly associated with longevity when it's technically not a longevity supplement, but that's really just marketing language? Now, to your point, in the toolkit, you're a physician and you are looking at this person holistically and saying, all right, this is where the weaknesses are, this is where the strengths are. How can we try to create a solution customized to this individual? And you might use different tools and combine them, and the some product of it all might lead to improvements in longevity plus improvements in quality of life metrics here and now today. But in terms of the way that the molecule is represented or the company represents itself as longevity, I just say that, caveat emptor to the consumer. Just be aware that simply because something calls themselves longevity doesn't mean it is. You need to consider, has it extended lifespan in animal studies, in well-controlled animal studies? Has it been studied in human double-blind placebo-controlled study and found to have a favorable effect on markers associated with health span and lifespan? And was that study run by a CRO where it's a corporation that the company's paying to find a result? Or was it done by academics who their entire livelihood is based on their reputation? And so they're going to be really focused on providing very, very high quality results at the highest standard from their studies.
Well, thank you so much. I know I want to be respectful of your time here, so I really appreciate you joining. I'm actually just seeing there was actually one question that relates to fasting and autophagy. I'll send it to you, Chris, if you want to respond. You can respond in just the comment section on the LinkedIn event. But I really appreciate everyone tuning in, and I really appreciate you spending some time with us, Chris. This was super fun and a really thoughtful and engaging conversation. So thank you once again.
Thank you. And I can answer that question very quickly. I do
Oh
think
yeah,
that
go.
there's a balance between pro-growth autophagy and moderate to high protein paired with intermittent fasting and periodic fasting mimicking diets like Prolon. Yeah. I mean, it's about like going in and out. So there's different ways to do it, different styles. And, we don't have pure clean data to know which one is best. But in terms of what I think is a fair approach to it, having higher protein, weightlifting, pro-growth cycle, and then going into more of a fasting and fasting mimicking cycle in and out of those, just like we have feast and famine cycles throughout history. I think that that's a fair approach to take.
Thank you so much, Chris. Thank you everyone for tuning in, and I'll see you all in the next one. Have a
Thank
good week.
you.
Bye bye.
Bye.